refuge and cool water refuge. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. Well, okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. You can all hear me okay? Okay. Well, I'm really happy to be back here. It's really great to see folks here and be back. The project I'm going to talk about today is a collaboration between Western Washington University and the Nooksack Indian Tribe. So just wanted to give a little shout out to my collaborators, Michael Maudlin, Treva Coe, and Eric Stover of the Nooksack Tribe, and also my former grad student, Sydney Jantz, who contributed a lot to this work. And the work we're going to be talking about focuses a lot on habitat restoration, specifically with relation to temperature. Probably don't have to tell anybody in this room that stream temperatures, elevated stream temperatures are an important stress affecting Pacific salmon. Elevated temperature is actually the most frequent source of water quality impairment in the state of Washington. And that really shouldn't come as any great surprise because just about every land use, everything we do to rivers and watersheds results in warming rivers pretty much. And of course, the warming is only going to become more intense and more frequent in the coming years with global climate change. Temperature affects salmon at every life history stage. For this work, we're focusing on adult holding, where we've seen that for salmon populations that undertake spawning migrations in the summertime, like some sockeye populations or spring Chinook, early Chinook, as we call them in Whatcom County, we know that elevated temperatures can have an effect on migration times, mortality rates, and spawning success. So a common restoration approach to try and help mitigate some of the effects of elevated temperatures involves the construction of engineered log jams. And probably most of you are familiar with the concept. These are engineered structures made out of wood that are designed to mimic the effects of natural log jams in rivers. The engineering helps to provide some design stability and make sure that they stay where they're supposed to stay and do the functions that they're supposed to perform. And one of the ways we've been using them up in Whatcom County is to help create pockets of thermal refuge. So the idea here is that in rivers that have relatively flat topography or relatively featureless, we can build engineered log jams, which will then scour river flow and cause the river to scour out a deep pool in the stream bed, and that will help to create deep, complex pools. And these types of wood-formed pools can also be useful. They can provide good thermal refuge habitat for salmon, for a few reasons, partly because they're just deeper parts of the river. So the greater volume of water in that location has more thermal inertia, so it doesn't heat up to the same degree in the heat of the summer. In a lot of cases, the wood and maybe the trees that are growing on that get started on nurse logs on the wood itself can provide a little bit of shading. And also, just it provides some velocity refuge where the fish doesn't have to expend so much energy to hold its position. And so that can help offset some of the energetic costs of being in hot water for salmon. So one of the key benefits of these engineered log jams is that they provide, relatively immediate effects compared to, say, planting streamside trees or curbing greenhouse gas emissions. An engineered log jam, once it gets built, will start to generate pools pretty quickly, after the next high channel forming flow. That's not to say that it's better than those other things or that they're mutually exclusive. The strategy in YR1 and probably all throughout the Salmon Recovery Board throughout Washington is the idea is to use engineered log jams as kind of an interim stopgap measure to try and create or improve habitat while natural habitat forming processes are recovering. So, okay, now, if we're using wood-formed pools to provide thermal refuge, that can be especially effective if they're in areas that are receiving some kind of cool water input, like maybe a cool tributary stream or some subsurface upwelling. In these cases, if you can co-locate this deep wood-formed pool with a source of cool water, then you have this kind of velocity refuge with high thermal inertia where you've got some cooler water, and that can be a very beneficial place for adult salmon to rest when they're making their way upstream. But these kinds of cool water inputs aren't always available at project sites. And so that's why we got the idea that maybe we could install these kinds of log jams in such a way as to promote localized subsurface upwelling. And more specifically, we're talking about localized hyporheic upwelling. So, you guys, and if you have any questions along the way, feel free to, or if I'm going too fast or anything, just tell me to slow down. Okay, so the hyporheic zone. Hyporheic zone is the saturated subsurface zone that's beneath and in some cases adjacent to river systems. It's the area that contains a mixture of deep groundwater and surface water. So it's kind of an ecotone, but compared to the surface water in the stream, the hyporheic water is characterized by having relatively slow flows, but pretty constant flow and buffered temperature regimes. It tends not to heat up to the same extent during the heat of the summer. And in most streams, there can be significant amounts of water that moves back and forth, that upwells from the hyporheic zone and downwells back down into the hyporheic zone from the stream. We call this hyporheic exchange, just water being, exchanged between the surface and the hyporheic. And it turns out that hyporheic exchange is driven more than anything else by stream bed topography. So if you have a stream that looks like this cartoon here, where you've got, say, the tail of a riffle, at the tail of a pool, that's typically where water gets forced down into the hyporheic zone. And then it'll move through the gravel, through these hyporheic flow paths, and it'll typically upwell at the head of a pool. And these are patterns that we see over and over again. So with this in mind, Treva and Michael and I had the idea that maybe by creating scour pools in areas that previously had no pools, we could capture some of the hyporheic flow that might be moving underneath the stream channel. So if you have a stream like this one here, where you've got the surface water flowing downstream here, and then you've got some hyporheic flow meandering its way through the gravel, you put your log jam in, it scours out a pool, and then the idea is that at the head of that pool, we might expect to see some more hyporheic flow coming up, and maybe that could help bring some cooler or more buffered water into that pool. So that's the objective of this research. So the idea is to test this potential, to test the effectiveness of this approach, see if we can use engineered log jams to promote these localized hyporheic upwellings and create pockets of cool water refuge for returning adult salmon. Okay, so the study takes place in the South Fork of the Nooksack River. That's up in Whatcom County near Bellingham. The South Fork is a river that is severely affected by temperature. If any of you ever, maybe some of you have ever gone inner tubing on the South Fork? Anybody ever been up there? It's a popular recreational pastime. It's actually since been banned because of stress for salmon. But the reason people like to go tubing on the South Fork is because it's very warm. The South Fork drains snowfields from the Twin Sisters, whereas the North and the Middle Fork of the Nooksack drain glaciers from Mount Baker and Mount Shuckson. So you wouldn't want to go tubing there because that water stays cold throughout the summer. But South Fork is characterized by very low flows towards the end of summer and elevated temperatures. And the other thing we see in the South Fork, especially in the lower South Fork, is there's very low densities of large woody debris in the river. There's a lot of farming in the watershed, and a lot of the wood has been cleared historically to facilitate navigation. And so as a result of there being not a lot of wood, there's not a lot of deep, complex pools. So this is some habitat mapping from a while ago that shows that it's mostly just riffles and runs, shallow water. The other thing about the South Fork is that it is home to a population of early Chinook salmon that is considered an essential population for recovery of the broader ESA-listed evolutionarily significant unit of Chinook salmon. These are fish that enter the river towards the end of July, beginning of August, and they spawn in the fall, and so they're spending all of the low flow, hot summer period in the river. And so not surprisingly, this population is vanishingly low. I think the recovery goal is 9,900 fish, and the geometric mean is something like 62 over the past 50 years. So there's very few of these fish coming back. Okay, so more specifically, within the lower South Fork, this work takes place in a reach that we call the Nessets Reach, which is a 2.5 kilometer reach that's near Acme that's considered a priority for restoration for this early Chinook population. It's a good place for this kind of work, we think, because it has pretty hydraulically conductive substrate. So we've got a gravel bottom with a lot of flow through. So we see a lot of upwelling during the low flow season. And maybe more importantly, this is the site of a fairly large scale habitat restoration project that was undertaken by the Nooksack tribe. So this involved, over this 2.5 kilometer reach, the tribe built about 25 different logjam structures in the river. These were built in 2016, and then a few more were built in 2018. And so the basic idea with these log jams was to take a stretch like this. So this is good old plot 2124, where you can see the water is very shallow. This was taken sometime in August. This picture was taken. You've got just a long riffle, and then after the log jam was built, we see the beginnings of the development of a scour pool. Now you've got riffle up here, but somewhat deeper water here, and so that's the idea. All right, so our project follows before-after control impact design. So before we started thinking about this, before this project started construction, so actually for several years beforehand. So with the planning, the engineering designs, we knew where the log jams were going to be built. We were able to predict where we thought the scour pools were likely to form. And so we started collecting data, trying to characterize those sections of the river. So each of our before plots was an area of about 225 square meters. And we chose that size because that's a little bit bigger than the average size of the scour pool that is formed by log jams on the South Fork by past projects. So we figured that was an appropriate size. Then after the log jams were built, we came back to the same spot and measured the same variables in the actual location of the scour pool. And then the control impact part comes in because there were a number of logjam structures that were planned, and they were meant to do the same sorts of things, but those ones were never actually built because mostly was we lost landowner. The landowners were no longer willing to let us use their property to bring the excavators across, and there's some funding cuts as well. So bad news for restoration, but good news for science because it gave us some, comparable control plots to study. So with all this, we ended up with 8 different impact plots and 4 control plots. And for most of these, we got several years of baseline data before the log jams were built. And then we've got at least a couple of years of baseline data afterwards. The reason this looks so imbalanced and ugly is because I don't know how many of you work in rivers, but rivers are kind of a pain because they move. And so there was a major avulsion in the winter of 2015, 2016. And so I've got about 3 years worth of baseline data for places that are no longer in the river, that are now dry gravel bars. And then there was another avulsion in 2021 after that big flood. So we lost some of our pools, but the river will come back eventually. Okay, so coming back to our research objective. So the goal was to assess the effectiveness of this habitat restoration approach, and more specifically, we wanted to see if these log jams are, what kind of an effect they're having in terms of stream bed topography, hyporheic exchange, temperature, and fish use also. So start with stream bed topography. We just starting before the log jams were built, we went to our experimental plots with just a simple survey level and stadia rod, and we measured stream bed topography over an area with about a 2.5 meter resolution. And then we repeated that. And one of our key response variables was what we're calling residual profile depth or pseudo residual pool depth. And that's basically just the depth at any given point that we want to know about relative to the highest elevation at the tail of the plot. So like if we're, so we've got the relative elevation of this bed point relative to the highest elevation here at the pool tail end. So it's just a way of, looking at the pool depth relative to what was the riffle beforehand. And so if we look at some of the preliminary results, so here's a bathymetric map from one of our control plots. This is 2344, where we've got like 4 years of baseline data and then a couple of years of post-baseline. So you can see that the darker colors represents lower elevations. So it's analogous to a deeper point in the in the topography. And so you can see that this is what the map looked like before the logjam was built in 2015, and this is what the map looked like 2 years after the logjam was built. This was in 2018. And you can see there's really not much of a difference. Here's another control plot. Here too, you can see there's been a bit of a shift. You know, the river moves around a little bit, but not much. But then, okay, but that's kind of my point, because it's really subtle. Whereas if you look at the impact plot, you can see that there's a big difference here. So this is plot number 1301, which was pretty flat in 2015, but in 2018 had a pool that was more than 2 meters deep in some points in terms of residual pool depth. So a deep complex pool is developed. And so if we just look at the data overall, here's another one, 1304. You can see here we've got something happening here. Okay, so if we just look at the maximum depth, so if you look at that maximum pseudo residual pool depth in any one plot, you know, beforehand, it was right around 50 centimeters, but after construction, we can see that the maximum, on average, the maximum was more like 150 centimeters. So we're seeing more of these deep, complex pools. And 1 meter is kind of the benchmark that we have for what counts as a deep pool, really. Okay, if you look at the percentage of bed points that are lower than that, that are deeper than that 1 meter residual marker, we can see that beforehand it was pretty much zero, and it stays zero at the control plots, but at the restored plots, we're seeing that, you know, about 20% or so of our plots have at least a couple of points in space that are deeper than that.
Should be working.
Okay, great, thanks. We'll just keep doing this for now, but thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, yeah, right. Okay, so that's stream bed topography. What about hyporheic exchange? So to measure hyporheic exchange, we use these devices called piezometers, which sounds very technical, but it's really just a length of PVC pipe. We used a 1/2-inch diameter PVC pipe that was perforated over the bottom 15 centimeters, and we inserted these so that those perforations were about 30 centimeters below the stream bed. And the idea is that'll capture some of the hyporheic flow below the stream bed. And we can characterize upwelling potential or hyporheic exchange through what's called vertical hydraulic gradient. And that's basically just a measure of the height of water inside the piezometer relative to the height of water in the surface stream surrounding it. So if you have a piezometer that's inserted into the gravel over here, and the water level inside the piezometer is below the surface of the stream, that tells you that there's less pressure, or that there's less pressure in that spot in the hyporheic zone where you're sampling or less head than there is at the surface, overlying surface stream, and that's indicative of a site that's likely to have downwelling. Whereas if the water level inside the piezometer is higher than your surface stream, that's indicative of an upwelling potential. And so here's a picture. You can sort of see that. You can see that the water inside the piezometer, we use these clear ones so you can see this, is, you know, about 1.5 centimeters higher. And so that's a fairly strong upwelling over there. So at each of our plots, we installed a grid of piezometers. We knock them down with sledgehammers, singing John Henry was a steel driving man. And we put them in at a 5-meter resolution, a grid like that. We usually got anywhere from 16 to 24 piezometers in at a plot. And then, so, you know, beforehand, the pre-restoration plot might look something like this. And then afterwards, we came in at the actual location of the scour pool, and we especially wanted to capture the head of that pool because that's the area where we really expect to see upwelling. And if you look at the percentage of piezometers that show upwelling in any one plot, you can see that, you know, before restoration, there's no difference between the control and the impacts. It's generally about a third, about 30%. But we see an increase in the number, in the percentage. It goes up to, you know, more than 40% at the impact plot. So we're seeing more upwelling. Okay, which brings us to temperature. We're getting more towards the actual meat of the question here. So to characterize the temperature in these plots, we looked at the seasonal trends. So we installed temperature loggers, these little tidbits in the center of each plot, and had them record at 1 hour intervals throughout the low flow season. But we also wanted to get a sense of the spatial patterns as well. So we did these kind of snapshot surveys with an instant read thermometer where we were able to measure temperatures along that 5-meter grid, including near all of our piezometers. And we could also check out the difference between the stream bed and the surface. And because these snapshots took place at different times, we didn't measure all of the plots in one day. We would use a measure of relative temperature. So we would compare all of those temperatures against the simultaneous temperature that was recorded at a USGS gauging station a couple of kilometers upstream at Saxon Bridge. So the idea then is that a warm spot is one that's showing temperatures that are warmer than what's being recorded at that moment at the bridge, and a cool spot is one that's showing temperatures that are cooler than what's recorded there. That was just our arbitrary base because we knew we had temperatures recorded all the time there. Okay, so in terms of preliminary results, one of the things we looked at was that maximum relative temperature, and you can see that on average at both the control and the impact plots, most of our plots had maximum temperatures that were more than 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than the gauge. Whereas after the restoration, we saw that maximum had come down to more like 1.25 degrees, or a little bit more than 1 degree. If you think of it, a better measure probably is the 7-day average of daily maximum temperature in the plot. And you can see that, at the control and impact plots, it was really right around, or even in some cases greater than 20 degrees. But in the logjam plots, it came down quite a bit in the restored plots. This is just, real simple graphs. I don't have any stats for you right now. Okay, in terms of the daily temperature range, because one of the other things we were looking for was how well buffered there, how great is that diel fluctuation between the hottest part of the day and the cool of the night. And we saw that, prior to the log jams being built, those streams were pretty flashy. There was a more than 4 degree range on average, but after log jam construction, that comes down to about 3 degrees. So we're seeing cooler, more stable temperatures. Okay, what about fish use? So to get a sense of how the fish are responding to these log jams, we conducted a series of snorkel surveys. So we would just snorkel down the river and we would count how many fish were in different parts of the river, especially, taking careful note of which log jams they were in. On average, through our adult holding counts, what we're finding is, and this is a conservative estimate, what we're finding is that more than 75% of the fish we see are in those log jam formed pools. They're hunkered down at the bottom of those wind formed pools. It's probably more like greater than 85% because like some of the ones that were counted outside those log jam pools were just ones that we scared and spooked them so they darted out. Pretty typical survey was the one we did in 2019, where we counted 33 adult Chinook in the Reach. All 33 of them were in pools. 28 of those were in logjam formed pools, and 23 of them were stacked up in one particular pool, logjam 1301. And that was the one I showed you with that very deep pool. Okay, how are we doing for time? All right, great. Okay, so what conclusions can we draw from this? It seems pretty clear that the log jams, this confirms what we know from other studies, that these engineered log jams are by and large pretty effective at creating pools. We see that there's a change in stream bed topography. And there's some evidence to suggest that these log jam pools could be effective at providing thermal refuge. We're seeing that they're more likely to have upwellings. They are generally cooler and more stable, and they do seem to be used preferentially for holding by adult salmon. But I want to point out that the deep pools that have upwellings are not always especially cold. So this is that 1301 pool, and here are some of the snapshot temperature recordings that were taken in August of 2018. And although this pool was more than 2.5 meters deep in some places, and although it had all kinds of upwelling at its head, the temperatures at the bottom of this pool were no cooler than the riffle immediately upstream. So this was a bit of a head scratcher. But it tells us that these hyporheic flow paths are not always cooler or more stable. I mean, that was one of the underlying assumptions behind this research, is that, well, hyporheic flow is always really well buffered. It's going to be cooler. If we can encourage more of that to come up, then, we're in business. But that seems not to be the case. So to further get at this question, we put some tidbits in piezometers to actually measure. We'd taken some snapshot readings of hyporheic temperature, but we really wanted to get a sense of the whole seasonal pattern of temperature. And so this was unfortunately after that 2021 avulsion, so it's some different plots. But in each of these plots, we had a logjam formed pool with a riffle immediately upstream. And so we installed our piezometers to a depth of about a little more than 30 centimeters below the gravel. We put the temperature logger down at the bottom of that. So we were recording the temperature in the hyporheic zone below that riffle just before it upwells into the pool. And we'd also made sure that these were all in upwelling zones so that we knew we were measuring water that was upwelling up from the hyporheic zone, not down from the surface stream. And so at some of these plots, we found a temperature pattern. Oh, I should point out that also at the same time, we installed temperature loggers on the stream bed, in the surface stream, in the riffle, within a meter, just about a meter upstream of where we'd installed the piezometer. I forgot about that because you can't see it, because I did such a great job of concealing it with my river rock, so nobody would mess with it while it's in the river. Okay, so at most of these plots, we saw a pattern that we more or less expected. So here, this is plot 1306, and the orange lines that are not super visible represent the surface stream temperature. So you can kind of see how you've got, pretty large diel fluctuation. You can kind of see it, right? If you squint, yeah. And then the blue line is the hyporheic temperature immediately underneath it. And as you can see, it generally doesn't get as hot. It's more buffered, much less variation. So this was more or less what we expected to see. But then at one plot, this is plot 1316, we saw this, where the stream temperature gets up to 22 degrees Celsius in the heat of the day, but the hyporheic temperature stays buffered below 13 degrees Celsius. And again, I want to point out, this isn't deep groundwater. This was the same depth, only about a little more than 30 centimeters below the gravel. So we're tapping into a very different hyporheic flow path that is staying much, much colder. But then at some of our plots, we see that the hyporheic and the overlying surface stream temperatures track each other perfectly. The hyporheic zone is no cooler, no more stable. It's exactly the same. So it seems as though we've got a bit of a pattern. We've kind of characterized our plots as being either cold, cool, or warm. So we had this was the one really cold plot, 1306, where the hyporheic, and when I say cold, cool, warm, I mean talking about the hyporheic flow relative to the surface stream, because the surface stream temperatures were almost identical throughout the reach. They're pretty much the same. So we've got this cold plot, we've got these two cool plots, and then we've got these three warm plots here in this section. And one of the things that we noticed is that this seems to be correlated with, I would say, driven by the channel geomorphic units, or the stream bed topography, the habitat that we're seeing. So for example, if you look at plot 2124, 1313, and 1312 here, you guys see that? Yeah. You've got a riffle immediately upstream. That's by design. There's a riffle above all the pools. That's where we sampled. But immediately upstream from that riffle, at each of those plots, there's a run. So a run is a deep-ish, but not very deep, swiftish kind of habitat unit. You can think of it as an intermediary between a riffle, which is shallow and swift, and a pool, which is deep and slow. So it's more of an intermediary kind of feature. Whereas if we look at our cold and our cool plots, you can see that immediately upstream from the riffle, there's another deep scour pool. And we think that this plays an important role. There's research out there, the work by Tanina and Buffington and some of their coworkers, that shows that it has to do with this spatial gradient in depth and velocity. So over here, if you look at the situation that's happening in the cold and cool upwellings, if you go from a pool to a riffle, that's a very steep gradient in depth, which translates to its steep gradient in velocity, because you're going from deep, slow water to shallow, swift water. And that will force more water into the hyporheic zone, and it'll force it deeper down into the hyporheic zone too. Whereas in this type of situation, which is what we're seeing at the warmer upwellings, where you have just a transition from a run to a riffle, the spatial gradient is not as great. So there's not quite as much water being forced down into the hyporheic zone, and it's not being forced as deep. So when you get to the upwelling spot over here, we're tapping, these flow paths have been deeper, and they have more water sent into them. And so they're more likely to be cooler and buffered. That's what we're seeing. So if we go back to our conclusions, it's worth pointing out that not all upwellings are equal. So you can have an upwelling, but it's not necessarily going to help cool your pool. We tend to see cooler flow paths below that riffle pool sequence, which I think, like, in terms of a prescription, like, what can we do to help bring this about? It suggests that maybe that means we should be building our log jams more closely together at closer spacing, so that one pool can help feed the flow path for the next pool downstream. That's not radical news. I mean, we've already talked about wanting to have more closer spacing of pools for these fish, but this is another reason why that might be beneficial. Another thing I want to point out is some of you might remember that this 1301 pool, this is the deep 2-meter pool that had all the upwellings but was still warm. That was still the fish that had the pool that had 23 fish stacked up in it that summer. So it tells us that those deep pools that have warmer upwellings are still being used by fish. And I think part of that may be a bit of a sampling problem, whereby, when you do a snorkel survey on any given day, where you find the fish, if you're talking about adults on their migration, where you find the fish isn't necessarily the best habitat in the river, because they don't have the choice to stay there. They're making their way upstream to their spawning ground. So they're only going to spend so much time in any one area. But what I think also is that this also tells us that even if these logjam formed pools are not necessarily any cooler, the fact of them being pools, that velocity refuge, is still beneficial. That being able to rest, get out of the current, helps to offset some of those energetic costs of being in that hot water. So, all right, well, that's all I have. So I just want to say thanks to funding for this project was actually provided by Sea Grant and also the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center here at UW. So thanks to those guys, as well as to Salmon Recovery Funding Board. And I also want to say thanks to the crews of undergrads that have spent their summers out on the river pounding piezometers in for us, made this possible. So thanks. Yeah, sure. Yeah, any questions, anyone? Yes.
Didn't we go through a period of time when they were improving river conditions by removing all those?
Yeah, we did. There was a time when woody debris was removed from rivers because, well, mostly to facilitate navigation for humans, but there was a time when people thought that there was a barrier to migration. I would say we can look back now and safely say that was wrong.
I wonder if that was because some areas that have been logged, that maybe too much material was put in.
That could be. Yeah, I mean, we do see that. We do see that in some disturbed streams where there's logging, you have intense peak flows, you can get, debris torrents that bring all the slash down from timber operations. And that can choke out a stream and present a migration barrier and BOD and all sorts of things. But I think for a lot of rivers in Western Washington, certainly for the South Fork of the Nooksack, the problem is not enough wood.
Also, if I might ask another question, what would be the difference?
I think the difference is that the pools would then just fill in as soon as that first high flow comes. So you put these log jams in, and then the flow is deflected down, and it's continually deflected down. And they're kind of like living organisms in that they rack up new material And so you saw those big pilings in the pictures. So we want to anchor them in place because you don't want them to take out a bridge downstream or anything, but they'll change in their shape and structure before they break down. But wherever they are, they'll continue to deflect flow and that pool will persist. And some other research we're doing suggests that you start to get the pool forming almost immediately. As soon as the high flows come, we get what we call a channel forming flow. But it can take 3 or 4 years for those pools to reach their maximum depth potential. Yeah. Yeah, anything else? Tom?
Jim, I noticed you refer to these as early Chinook, not spring.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, a couple related things. What set of selective forces would have caused the evolution of this timing rather than something a bit later, as you might see?
Yeah.
And our current, are they at a time when the river is cooling, in which case they might evolve later, or is it actually warming when they come in which case they have to evolve the wrong way? Kind of where did this start and where's it going?
Yeah. So to answer your question, the term early Chinook is what the tribe uses. And that's because it's kind of they're really summer run Chinook. They really enter the river system in July or so, but it's kind of a continuum between spring and summer. So they just use the blanket term early Chinook. And yeah, Gordon and I were talking about this earlier, but like what possible selective pressure could favor entering the river so early? And I don't have a good answer for that. There is a fall run as well in this river. And the fall run is much healthier, but the fall run, although for ESA purposes, it's considered a wild run, but I believe it's descended from hatchery stock, maybe even from the Green River hatchery. So it's a totally different, it's a different ecotype. So
Nearby Skagit has quite a range of time.
right, yeah. So yeah, I'd have to think about that some more. I don't, because all I can say is that for most of the 10,000 years that these fish have been in this river, the temperatures have not been as hot as they are now. That's the only thing I can think of. Another question? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the time referring to ice and
Yeah.
how long or how well do these log jams survive?
So far, they'll stay there. Like I've actually got a whole slideshow of stranded log jams. It's very sad. But they'll stay there for years. I mean, wood doesn't decompose very much when it's constantly inundated, but the drying and wetting will lead to some rot. Some of the structures that were built in like 2008 are already starting to rot away. The more recent ones should have more longevity. But I think that the idea is we can expect them to persist for several years, maybe not decades, but years. And that's actually a strategy on the North Fork. So the South Fork, we've got a few avulsions, but the North Fork of the Nooksack is just a braided mess. That river just flows back and forth across the valley. And some of the log jams are actually designed to help try and force it into some more permanent channels. But also what we're doing there is building along the valley, knowing that in any given year, a lot of these log jams are not going to be engaged with the low flow channel, but that in every year, at least some of them will. And it's been a tough sell for funders, right? They don't like to see that you spent tens of thousands of dollars to build a log jam that's not in the river right now. But we have to allow that these rivers are dynamic entities, and that's what they're going to do, whether we like it or not.
Someone did you take oxygen?
Oxygen
with the temperature?
We did not. We have a few snapshots here when we were using the YSI. We've got a few percent saturation values, but not in a really, because that's another thing. So that's another piece of this puzzle that you bring up is in terms of the flow path. Like I think the topography plays a role, but also there's probably an optimal flow path length, because the longer flow paths are going to be the coolest flow paths, but they're also going to be depleted in dissolved oxygen. So if you have a pool that has a very long, deep groundwater flow path upwelling into it, that might be cool, but it might not be good habitat because it might be very low in DO. And so that's something else we need to look at. That and the mixing lengths. Because with some of these pools, depending on their geometry, you could have cool water upwelling and then it just dissipates within a few centimeters.
Thanks for a really interesting book and very innovative study.
Thank you.
I was wondering, do you have any information about the bedrock formation underneath these? Because the combination, I would imagine, of bedrock with the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to imagine. Pools in itself will be the only factor that's affecting the dropping in the bed.
Yeah, absolutely. The bedrock, so the bedrock represents, the bottom limit of the hyporheic zone. We've got a lot of gravel deposits that are fairly thick, but there are places with exposed bedrock on that river. In fact, one of the deepest, most heavily used pools by salmon is a bedrock pool. They call it Preacher Rock because it's also a very good swimming, diving place. And that pool is, I don't know, it's pretty much bottomless and it's filled with fish. Although increasingly in the summertime, it's filled with suckers as well as salmon. But yeah, I think that plays into it as well. That's gonna affect where you can have hyporheic exchange for sure. And it's gonna limit the depth of your flow path. Sure, back there.
Saltwater guys. For the piezometer, is that a manual read when you guys go through?
Yeah.
Sort of like temperature logger, log.
You can do that. So the most accurate way, especially if you want to, like if you want to measure things like hydraulic conductivity there, you need to do a falling head test. And if you want to do that accurately, you should really have a pressure transducer in the piezometer that records that. In our case, we haven't done that because you need a wider piezometer to accommodate that. And one of the nice things about the 1/2-inch piezometers is that they're a lot easier to knock down. And they're still kind of a pain. I actually promised myself I would never do hyporheic research again about 10 years ago. Here I am. So in our case, we're doing it all manually. So we're really looking at, because we're only interested in, to a coarse extent, like on the order of centimeters to a 1/2 centimeter, whether it's positive or negative vertical hydraulic gradient. I mean, we can see that some upwellings are stronger where you've got like a 3 centimeter differential, but that's the biggest one out there is 3 centimeters. So what we've been doing is, well, Rick Edwards, when he was here, had a technique that was known as plunking, where it had to be a tape measure from Ace Hardware, and you could send it down into the piezometer and kind of dap at the surface. And it was really more of a dark art than a science because no one else could really replicate it. So instead, for years, we used a wooden dowel that was graduated and we just dip it down and see where the water level was. But I've started using just a water level indicator. So it's really thin, but now I need glasses, so I have trouble reading the numbers on it. And it goes down and it beeps as soon as it hits the water, so we can get a sense of the depth. We get pretty accurate depths that way. And we'll take, 2 or 3 measurements to make sure we're getting it. And we have tried some falling head tests as well, because then we could look at the upwelling potential and actually make an estimate of how much water is upwelling. But all of these plots, the hydraulic conductivity is so high that to do a manual falling head test, like they're, on chalk river streams in England, you could sit overnight timing it. But in these cases, it's really just a test of my reflexes, like how fast can I hit the stopwatch? It's, less than a second. So we just sort of assume it's highly conductive and we're just using upwelling potential as our response variable. Thanks. There's another question behind you. Yeah.
This is really exciting, really well. I've also thought water bias in offshore system where you're not getting by fish caught for volume filtered. And here, I guess, how do you know that you're not just catching more fish in the pool because there's more volume, there's more space in that region compared to really shallow possibly. And then secondly, have you looked at not just are these engineered log jams producing areas with higher abundance of fish, but also are they year after year resulting in a higher abundance of fish in that stream and for the bigger impact?
Right. Okay, I'll take the first one first, because so how do we know that it's not just that there's more fish in there because there's more volume of water? Well, so we're at the absolute low flow time of the year. This is the time of the year when the fish are in the river. And, starting this, we went into it with the understanding that the fish are more likely to want to use these deep pools for the energetic, for that velocity refuge. I think, I guess I don't have a really good answer, mathematical answer for what you're saying. But we have ecological life history reasons to expect that they would preferentially want to use those habitats. I think in terms of total area surveyed, even though there's more volume of water in those pools, I guess I do have a math answer for you. In terms of total area surveyed, the pools are actually smaller. There's long riffle distances between those pools, and yet they're still disproportionately, overwhelmingly found in those pools. So I think we have reason to think that they are found in there, or that they're there for a reason, rather. Okay, and what was the second question? Oh yeah, that's the real question. Is this actually translating to any kind of sustained productivity of fish? I don't know. We don't know. I mean, these log jams were built in 2016. So if we're talking about Chinook salmon, it has like maybe 2 generations. So it's much too early to say. And also it's hard to tease out from other factors, because at the same time on that river, the Skookum Hatchery has started a conservation hatchery program where they're using local brood stock to put more fish into the river. So we have seen more return. Returns are increasing over the past few years, but I wouldn't say that it's because of these refuge. So that's why we sort of curtailed our question to just, are we creating cool water refuge? And then the question of whether that cool water refuge is translating to any kind of population increase, that's going to take more time, and that'll be a tricky one, I think. Yeah.
Well, with that, I think we ought to adjourn outside, and Tom is going to buy Jim a beer, and let's thank Jim one more time.
Yeah, thank you all.